The next stop on our journey here in 4.3 is to determine if two functions are inverses of each other. And I'm looking at example 4 on page 278. But the rules are this. To determine if two functions are inverses of each other, we run the fog of those functions, f of g of x. And if the answer is x, good. And then we run the g of f of the function. And if the answer for the GOF is x, it's good. And what we have is g and f are inverses of each other. All right, those are the rules. So on example 4 on page 278, part A says, determine whether x cubed minus 1 has an inverse function. Well, the answer to that is yes. First of all, we know that the answer is yes. We just did this in the last example. But for a refresher, for any of those of you who may have skipped over that particular example, we would graph the function. Looks like the disco function here. And then we would check the horizontal line test. And as you can see, if we draw a horizontal line through this, it passes. So this is a one-to-one function, which means it does have an inverse. All right, now part B says, determine or verify if g of x equals the cubic root of x plus 1 is the inverse of f of x, which equals x cubed minus 1. All right, well, as inverse operations go, you know, everything in math, there is an inverse operation. If we add things, the inverse is to subtract things. If we multiply things, the inverse operation is to divide things. If we square things or cube things, then the inverse operation is to take a square root or a cube root or whatever it may be. And all those relationships goes both ways because the inverse operation is subtraction is addition. So let's look at this first to see if this even has a clue. This even fits potentially being inverses of each other. And then we'll go ahead and run the fog and GOF to see if they really are inverses of each other. Well, we have a cube here. And we have a cubic root over here. So that seems pretty close. I like that. I've got a plus 1. I've got a minus 1. Those are inverse operations of each other. So I'm feeling pretty good so far. The one thing that gives me pause, though, is over here, x and 1 are inside of the cubic root. Over here, only the x is being cubed. It's not like it's x minus 1 quantity cubed. So these may or may not be inverses of each other. They certainly have the feel for it. But let's go ahead and run the fog and GOF so we'll know if they really are inverses of each other. So let's run the fog first, right? F of g of x. And our g of x is going to be the cubic root of x plus 1. All right, so we go into our f of x equation, and we have x cubed. So we have x cubed, except our x is now the cubic root of x plus 1. And then there's still a minus 1 here. Well, when you have a cube of a cubic root, they cancel each other out. And what's left over then is just what's inside of that cubic root is an x plus 1. And there's still this minus 1 that comes along for the ride. And now we have plus 1 and minus 1 that cancel each other out. And this is just x. That's good. Because if it was something other than x, we could stop and say these are not inverses of each other. The fact that we got x as our rule state tells us that, hey, we're halfway to determining that these two functions are indeed inverses of each other. All right, so now let's run the GOF, which is g of f of x. So g of x cubed minus 1. So now we're going to go into the g of x equation, which is the cubic root of x plus 1. Except we don't have x anymore. What we have is x cubed minus 1. And then, of course, there's still plus 1 that's inside of this cubic root. Now, I put it in a parenthesis, as I usually do, to tell us that that was the x. But technically, this parenthesis doesn't really need to be there. It's just there to, again, tell us it was x. And so if I lose that parenthesis, what you're going to see is the fact that we have x cubed minus 1 plus 1. And once again, the minus 1 and plus 1 are going to cancel each other out, which is going to leave us with the cubic root of x cubed. And the cubic root of x cubed is just x. So the fact that both of these now gave us x tells us that, yes, indeed, these two functions given in B, the cubic root of x plus 1 and x cubed minus 1, are inverses of each other. In fact, that gives us another rule. Another way to describe an inverse function is to call it if we have f of x as one function, its inverse is called f negative 1 of x. But the rule is this: if you take a function of its inverse, or vice versa, the answer is always going to be the same, x. That's kind of a truism that we want to make sure we use going forward. Now, the last part of example 4, part C, talks about find the domain and range of each function. And we're not going to worry about that at this time.